Brothers, do you recall when the grasslands reached to the horizon? And the deafening roar of countless wings overhead? Back when Rome was a village at Britain, the Emerald Island. Before we gave up on our future and buried our dead.
So, Sumerians, pre-Akkadian period, episode 10. I'm using, of course, as always, I'm using Marvine's material with his permission. And I'm also using the material from the Arhet Center. It's a site in Russia. And I'm using specifically a lecture by somebody who is a professional specialist in Sumerology, in the study of the Sumerians and Sumerian texts. And his name is Vladimir Yemelyanov, and I'm using his Secrets of the Sumerian Civilization lecture material, as well as Marvine's material and other research. So I want to start this with a story. And the story is very well known to everyone, and that is the Epic of Gilgamesh. Of course, we've all heard about it. It's been much hailed for having the original biblical flood material in it. It was a sensation when it was originally discovered and was deciphered, because suddenly people realized that the biblical story of the flood is something that is much older. And so that's what the Epic of Gilgamesh is best known for. But I think what it needs to be known for, and one of the most interesting things about it, is how much of a human story it is. I'm letting David back in. Sorry, technical difficulties. So what is the Epic of Gilgamesh about? What makes it special? Well, first of all, it is our very first known literary work. Not a religious text, not a religious hymn. It is a literary work. And why is it a literary work? Because it is not a typical heroic epic story, because a heroic epic story, it has a specific structure to it. The Epic of Gilgamesh is interesting because it has two parts. The first part of it, it follows the same standard heroic epic seen in every culture, from Greek to Slavic to Germanic. The second half, suddenly you get into very almost postmodernist existential philosophical writing. So just real quick retelling of the story as it happens. In the city of Uruk, there lived a really cool dude by the name of Gilgamesh, and he was nobility. He was the son of gods, almost 2/3 a god himself. And he was a really skilled and great fighter. He was so skilled and so great that he managed to seize the control of the city completely from his co-ruler and began ruling. You know, basically drinking lots of beer, doing lots of partying, starting lots of fights, screwing lots of his subjects' wives, and otherwise just being a great and fantastic hero, as great and fantastic heroes are usually bound to be. And he was so fantastic at this ruling of his that the people of the city started crying out to the gods for justice and saying that we need to do something about this guy. He is bigger than everyone. He is tougher than everyone. He's out of control. He's just partying it up, and we are tired. So the gods decided to send a challenge upon him. And they sent upon him the wild man. The wild man, he lived in the wilderness, and his name was Enkidu. And Enkidu, he was covered in fur. He was truly a wild creature. He talked to animals. His mother and father were animals. He did not understand human laws, and he hated human beings because human beings hurt the animals. They killed and hunted the animals. And so he started coming to the vicinity of the city of Uruk, and he started freeing their cattle and otherwise just causing mischief and all kinds of trouble for the city. And so, of course, our hero, Gilgamesh, sets out to fight this evil, wild monster creature. And he goes out into the wilderness, and they wrestle and they fight, and they fight and they wrestle. And this goes on for like 7 days, right? And neither one of them can defeat the other one. They pretty much kicked each other's asses by this point in time. And at one point in time, they stop and they look at each other and they say, you know what, you're pretty cool. You're just as bad as I am. And actually, Gilgamesh says, Enkidu, you are a really awesome warrior. You must be a hero too. Why don't you come back to the city with me? Why don't you become my named brother? You know, my bro, my best friend. And Enkidu says, no, I live in the wilderness. I don't understand you human beings. I stay here with animals. You go away. You're pretty cool too. I really like you. But this whole civilization thing, it's really not my thing. But Gilgamesh wants a bro, right? He wants somebody who he can talk to, somebody who can understand him. So Gilgamesh goes back to the city and he does a little nasty trick. He sends out to the wilderness to recruit Enkidu as his best friend. He sends out a priestess of Inanna, basically what is known as the temple prostitute, to go and do her womanly action upon poor, simple Enkidu. And of course, you got to understand that these temple prostitutes, they're not our modern streetwalkers. These are highly trained, highly specialized priestesses. They are beautiful. They have extremely high status in the society. They are sophisticated, exquisite. They are trained in every form of pleasure and intellectual discourse. And they are, anybody who comes and pleases these temple prostitutes, and there were also male ones, they pay a token amount which goes towards the temple, and it's a sacrifice to the goddess Inanna, who is the goddess, of course, of sex and war. But also whatever pleasure you offer to the priestess of the goddess is basically a pleasure that you're providing to the goddess herself. And you need to understand who Inanna is. This is our later Ishtar. She likes to bang. She likes to bang a lot, all the time. And if you're about to go off to war, she'll bang you. If you win the war, she'll bang you. If you look cool, she just might bang you anyway. If she doesn't like you, she might bang you. She likes to bang. She really likes sex. So this beautiful priestess, the temple prostitute, goes out into the wilderness and she finds Enkidu and she has sex with him. And she has sex with him for 7 days and for 7 nights nonstop. And finally, he's never seen a woman before, let alone a beautiful priestess skilled in all kinds of sexual debauchery. And so in the end, when he's out of breath and he says, "Oh my gosh, you're so amazing. Who are you? Where did you come from? How do you know all this?" She tells him, "Well, I come from the city of Uruk. This really cool fellow that you recently have fought and weren't able to defeat. Well, he is the ruler of that city. And you know what? In that city of ours, there's more people like me. It's a pretty cool place. If you like what I do, you might want to come with me." And Enkidu says, "That's pretty cool. I think I want to know more about your city." And so he goes with her back to the city of Uruk. And of course, when she brings him to the temple, other priestesses join in and they have more sex. And eventually they shave and they wash and they trim the nails of Enkidu. And Enkidu turns out to be actually a pretty handsome hero. And him and Gilgamesh become best bros, best friends. They just down as they can be, their homies, right? And now the city has a problem because now there's two of them. And they're doing the same thing that Gilgamesh was doing to begin with, which is partying and, seducing wives and picking fights and drinking and doing anything but what they're supposed to do, which is rule the city. There's now a pair of them. Now they're best friends. They share all their secrets. People again cry out to the gods. And the gods say, "Okay, we're going to give them an impossible task." There's this place, and you got to understand that at this time in history, the area is still very fertile and very much a wild area. I mean, there are lions, there are hyenas, there's all kinds of wild beasts, there's wilderness, like true forested wilderness. And so there is a cypress grove not far from the city. And one of the gods gives the pair a task to go and acquire some cypresses in order to build a new door for the temple, for the god's temple. Well, the problem is that this cypress grove is being guarded by basically dragon-like creature. It's not a Western dragon, but basically a magical creature that is almost like a half-god, kind of like Medusa will be later on in Greek mythology, right? And this creature is put there because he's the guardian of the grove. He's put there by gods themselves. He's literally a servant of the gods. He is their watchdog. Well, the pair goes out to the cypress grove, and without much thinking, they go ahead and slay this dragon, which was not supposed to happen. The dragon was supposed to slay them. And they do others. I mean, they bring back the wood planks, they make the door, but they continue doing things like that. And once they have the taste of their heroic deeds, they continue to go about and start slaying all kinds of magical creatures, mighty magical guardians that belong to the gods. And that's just not cool at all. Gods are getting pretty sick of this stuff. Something needs to be done about this pair. So Inanna herself thinks, I'm going to break them up. And how do we do that? Well, we take one of the boys away from the other boy, right? So she comes down and she goes to Gilgamesh and she says, "Gilgamesh, I think you're pretty sexy. You know, I kind of like what you do. You're a pretty awesome hero. Would you be my husband? And Gilgamesh says, I don't care if you're a goddess. It's bros before hoes. Um, I'm not interested in you. And by the way, what happened to all your previous husbands? Oh, yeah, that's right. I remember they got ran over by their own chariots. You know, they had various temples, roofs collapse on them. You're kind of a hussy, aren't you? He says to the high goddess of sex and war, and the only friendly goddess really in the entire Sumerian pantheon. Yeah, Inanna is really flipping mad. I think he's the first and the last person in history of humanity who basically turned Inanna, also known as Ishtar, down. I mean, Ishtar, we will meet her over and over and over. She's been married to every major god throughout history. Nobody's ever told her no. And he didn't just tell her no, he pretty much called her not very good names. So Inanna is mad. She runs to her mother. She runs to her father. She says something needs to be done about these two. They're completely out of control. So she sends a bull onto the city, and it's a giant bull that devastates the city, that drinks all the water in the rivers, that, you know, kills all the other animals, that's running up and down the streets and killing citizens of the city. And Enkidu looks at the stuff, and he knows animals, and he says, you know what, this bull is pretty awesome, but I'll tell you what, bro, I'm going to grab him by the tail. I'm going to kind of spin him around, and you take a dagger and just shove it in his neck, and we're going to have us some awesome drinking horns, and we're going to have us some, you know, really good meat and some awesome hide, and we're going to rip this bull's heart out, and we're going to eat it. And they proceed to slay the magical bull very easily, kind of toyingly. And at this point in time, not only Inanna, but all the gods say that's enough. They are absolutely upset. Inanna is embarrassed. The two are partying. They've given the dead bull to the local mastership people who can make basically awesome drinking vessels for them out of the horns. They're bragging up and down the street. And so the gods decide, okay, we are going to teach Gilgamesh a lesson. Now, Gilgamesh, he's half divine. He's more than half divine, but Enkidu is nobody. He's just a wild man from the wilderness. So we are going to make Enkidu die. And there's a couple versions of the story. In one, there's a snake that's sent to kill Enkidu. In the other one, there is an illness that's cast upon him. Bottom line is, Enkidu gets very ill, and he starts dying very slowly, very painfully. And he looks at Gilgamesh and he says, brother, why have you abandoned me? You've been my best friend. And now I'm suffering alone. I can't see, I can't hear. I'm growing weak. I'm wasting away. Why won't you fight for me in this battle? And of course, Gilgamesh, tries to pray to the gods, but they won't listen. And he says, I'm here, brother. And he's just devastated by this horrible, slow death of his best friend. Well, Enkidu dies. And this really hits Gilgamesh hard. And he sits over his brother's body for the next, 6-7 days without burying him until the body starts rotting, trying to bring him back to life. And devastated, Gilgamesh buries his brother. And this is where the first part of the story ends. And now this is where the philosophical journey begins. Our Gilgamesh, who's never seen death like that, who's at the heights of his power, at the heights of his, physical strength and prowess, he decides that he's horrified by death. He's horrified that because him and Enkidu, they were almost identical. They were like twins in a way. And if Enkidu can die, first of all, he lost his best and only friend. Second of all, if Enkidu can die, so can he. He does not want to die. He does not want Enkidu to die. As a matter of fact, he decides that the whole thing of dying is kind of not cool. He decides that he is going to find immortality, or he's going to find a way to bring his brother back. He's going to do something about this unfair death thing. And so he sets out on a long journey. He goes up and down the mountains and talks to various gods, and everywhere he goes, he tells them what he's searching for, and all the gods tell him that's not possible. Immortality is something that only gods are given. You humans are all mortal. You're all going to die. But he's a hero. He's stubborn. He does various heroic deeds, and he finally finds one man, one human being who has been given the secret of immortality, and this man lives in a very special afterlife of all of his own with his wife that one has to cross the river of the dead to get to. And he comes to this man and he says, this dying thing, it's not right. I need to bring my brother back. I don't want to die myself. Something needs to be done. But the wise man, who incidentally tells him the story of the flood, which is why this wise man has this special immortal, kind of his own private afterlife with his wife, he says, you know, so he's basically the prototype of Noah that's going to be later transferred onto the biblical text. So he was a very pious man who saved humanity from that drought. I mean, not drought, from the flood, the other version of the drought. But anyway, he turns Gilgamesh down, but the man's wife, she feels bad for him, and she tells Gilgamesh, you know, there's a place far in the sea where there grows a special flower, and there's only one of them that ever grows. And if you manage to dive down so far and get this flower, you know, you can take it back and do whatever you choose with it. Long story short, of course, Gilgamesh being Gilgamesh, he manages to dive, he gets the flower, it's just one little flower. And so he sets on his journey back, and he's been through a lot of things. He's stuttered, he's tired, he's exhausted. It's been weeks, maybe months, and he's getting close to the city. You know, he's carrying this flower, and of course he's torn to, should I consume it? Should I try to bring my brother back? Should I bring it to the people of my city to try to give everybody immortality, right? But he decides that he's going to bring it back. And of course he is tired, and he comes near a lake that's pretty much within the sight of the walls of his home city. And he's so exhausted, he lays down for a nap. And that's when Inanna, who is still pretty pissed that he did not bang her, he probably would have been better off if he had, really. She sends a snake. And of course, the snake consumes the flower. And the snake becomes immortal. And we go right back to that conversation we've had a while back during, discussing early human mythology and mythology memes, where the idea of the snake being immortal because it changes its skin. Well, the snake consumes the flower, and Gilgamesh wakes up, and he has made this journey for nothing. He didn't save his brother. He didn't bring immortality to his people. He's not going to live forever. And so the book, and it's really a book, it's a philosophical book at this point in time, ends with the speech from Gilgamesh. You know, man, you need to live every day like it's your last. Enjoy the food and drink that you get. You know, give pleasure to your wife, love your children, give joy to your, co-citizens and people that live around you. Do good deeds as much as you can, because when you die, there's nothing good awaiting you. So live today, live now, and try to leave a good legacy. And that's where pretty much the story ends. Now, Gilgamesh becomes not just national and international hero. He is believed to be the first man to invent irrigation. He's believed to have built, some of the more impressive structures, fortifications around the city of Uruk. After this entire journey, according to the story, some of the versions of the story, he became the wise, very thoughtful, very caring ruler. But it is a very interesting and very human story, really about a person who was a teenager, who was doing a lot of stupid shit, and who pretty much got taught a very hard lesson at the expense of somebody very dear to him. So that's kind of what I wanted to open with. Now let's get into the meaty stuff. Does anybody want to say anything before I go on? Comments, questions, complaints? Okay. So now let's get back to the question of who are our Sumerians. We have heard Sumerians a lot. I mean, there's a lot of nonsense about them on ancient astronauts, various TV show channels and other nonsense. Sumerians are oftentimes associated with some sort of magical, otherworldly, even extraterrestrial cultures, right? Well, they are kind of mysterious, okay? They're kind of otherworldly, but not in the same way that ancient aliens people are claiming them to be. So the biggest problem that the scientists of, Sumerology, which is a separate discipline, have when they get to their symposiums and start talking to one another is really who were and what were the Sumerians. And the problem is, what is the object of the study? It seems to be that Sumerians is really a term that does not describe anything specific, any specific ethnic group, any specific people, any specific culture. And I will explain why. What do we know about Sumerians in general? Like, what is the hard known facts? First of all, we know a little bit about their appearance from their artwork. They were pictured with kind of smallish, like short statured, with shortish limbs, wavy hair, beautiful wavy hair, really large bulging eyes, rather prominent and very straight noses, usually wearing a woolen skirt and sandals or no sandals. And with their hands folded on their belly. That's about all we know about the way that they looked. They loved beer. They definitely made a lot of beer, and beer drinking was one of the most enjoyable things it seems that Sumerians had in their culture. There is even Sumerian sayings about how it's better to drink beer in your own garden than to wander new lands looking for adventures, things like that. They always, in all of their artwork, they're pictured in group settings. You do not have individual portraits unless it's a statuette, usually. Usually it seems like it's a collective doing things together. We know that they settled the South Iraq area, which is the most fertile area of that entire region. It was so fertile that even though it had pretty difficult wildlife at the time of the first arrival of people, of any kinds of people to that region, people refused to move from that region because they could get 2 harvests a year out of it. Moreover, that part of what later became the Sumero-Akkadian Empire or Sumero-Akkadian culture, in the Akkadian, in the north part of that culture, settlement, state, whatever you want to call it, it was very common to find deeds of sales of land, right? People were quite ready to sell their plots of land, to where in the Sumerian part of the same civilization, people were very hesitant to sell their plots because that land was very, very fertile, and it was just, people did not want to sell their family estates and their family properties. They were called Sumera by the people of Akkadia, which in there, it seems that in the actual Sumerian language, it was pronounced as Kengir or Kengir, and scientists think that Sumera is basically kind of a transliteration of that term into Akkadian, which, by the way, the Akkadian language is a Semitic language. It is from a completely different group of languages. We don't know, and while we're talking about the Akkadians, so we have this whole territory. The south part is, from that point on, known as Sumeria, and the north part is known as the Akkadia. Well, the Akkadian people, we don't know what basically the origin of the word Akkadia is either, because it doesn't seem to be like that is a Semitic. I mean, it's not a Semitic word, and it's not a Sumerian word. So it seems just like there were 2 regions of the country. One was called Sumeria, while the other one was called Akkadia. So what's the history of the region prior to the appearance of these mysterious people who obviously came from somewhere else? They even say so in their own text, that they are implants, that they migrated from a different region. Well, before that, there was first the population, the local, autochthonic population in the region, and they were called the Ubaid people, and that's an Arabian term based on a village where they were found near some of the remains. And it was actually a fairly advanced culture. There's a good chance that a lot of the accomplishments that we attribute to the Sumerian culture may have actually come from the Ubaidian culture, which existed there starting from probably about 6,000 BC. Sumerians arrived to the region around 4,000 BC, plus or minus. So for about 2,000 years prior to the arrival of Sumerians, we already had irrigation. We already had construction of temples. Agriculture was already being practiced in that region before the Sumerians arrived. Settlements were founded. These are the people who actually founded the city of Uruk. It was not the Sumerians who founded that city, and many other cities. And they had herding, they had irrigation, they had their first priesthood structure. They were the first ones, the Ubaidian people were the first ones to switch over from a 3-dimensional symbolic system where you make little figurines to represent certain objects. For example, if you're trying to count bushels of wheat, you make little, something that looks like a bushel of wheat, right? And then you count those and you know how many bushels of wheat you have. Well, they switched to a 2-dimensional writing system. This first pictograms, which are not easily read, but it seems that there's some correlation between those pictograms and the later Sumerian texts that are actually readable texts. And their social structure, from everything best that could be told, they had no such things as kings. They didn't really have nobility per se. What their society was ruled by was by individuals who were in charge of organizing irrigation works, and they were ruled by the brigade leaders for the agricultural works. So that was really the people who dominated their settlements, were the people who organized the labor. Now Sumerians arrived there about 4,000 plus or minus 4,000 BC, and the height of the Sumerian civilization before the Akkadian invasion was really up to 2,400 BC. So they lasted a good time, all of their own in that region. They had about 20 city-states. It was a loose association. They never joined into any sort of a unified force. Each individual city-state had its own god system, had its own calendar system, their own form of organization and rule. They usually had two leaders. It's a system that later been established. I mean, much later, much later. You know, in our basically millennia, Hazars will have the same system where you have a sacred leader of the people and then you have a military leader of the people. So basically head of church and head of military. And so the head of church was the high priest of the sacred marriage, which was an important fertility ritual. This is a priest that was called M. And then they had a military leader that was called a Wungal. And those two people kind of competed with each other and collaborated at times, but it was that balance of power, and that's how a lot of these cities were ruled. There was active intercity warfare, just like it will be in Greeks later on. And basically the Sumerian civilization abruptly came to an end, temporary end, I must say, in about 2400 BC, when the Akkadians, led by Sargon, rolled over them pretty much, not from the first attempt, but from repeated attempts. And they fell for the same reason that the Greeks fell to the Romans, and that is because they never could quite unite into a single force. There was too much intercity bickering between them. Okay, anybody wants to say anything else before I move forward? Comments, questions, complaints? Okay, then I'm going to move forward. So just so that we understand that, the progression of how things happened after this. So when the Akkadian period came on, and that was another rise of Sumerian civilization, what happened is, again, very similar to what happened with the Romans and the Greeks, because except Romans were, well, semi-civilized when they conquered Greece, really. I mean, as far as their literature and art and philosophy goes, Romans were not terribly civilized at that point in time. But so when the Akkadians took over the Sumerian cities, one thing that Akkadians brought to the table is that they were able to organize. Semitic people in general seem to be pretty good at building a kind of a singular, very hierarchy-based ruling structure. And so the Akkadians, who were desperate, who were fleeing from climate change happening in their original home territories, who were not quite as sophisticated as the Sumerians they just conquered. Well, they conquered them, and then they looked around and decided they wanted to be Sumerians. And they started taking on Sumerian names. They took on completely the Sumerian form of writing. A lot of their religious tradition, they assimilated and kind of intermixed with their own. So what we wind up having towards the second kind of boom of the Sumerian culture without the Sumerians is the Sumero-Akkadian empire, which originally was kind of partially divided between the two ethnicities, but eventually, the Akkadians really replaced the Sumerians. The Sumerian language lingered on just like the Latin language lingered on in medieval Europe for quite a few centuries, and even, I'd say, millennia after. But eventually it stopped being used at all in daily speech and just remained kind of to be a high society kind of scholarly language. And eventually the Akkadian empire itself got overrun by the Kuti barbarian tribes that came rolling from the mountains, and that's how that civilization, in its Sumero-Akkadian version, collapsed, only to be reborn later on as our beloved Babylon, the wonderful, sinful, tradeful, colorful, and rulers, kind of a very bustling city of Babylon that is going to rise to a status of an empire for a minute, then going to collapse back to being a city, and is going to pretty much make it as far as Alexander the Great. So this region has a long and fruitful life ahead of it. So, okay. Yeah, and I guess David is sharing images in the background, so if anybody wants to look at them, they're in the chat. I don't know what they are, but yeah. So, Sumerian language. Why do we have a problem in trying to figure out who the Sumerians are? Well, it's because it's a subject that keeps slipping through our fingers. The Sumerian language as such was discovered in 1851 in Nivea, where there was an Akkadian Sumerian dictionary found. Now, Akkadian being a Semitic language and fairly close to early Hebrew, it was not that difficult to decipher. But the second language that was included in these actual official dictionaries, originally the scientists had no idea what this language was. all they could tell us that it was not related to any known language. And some problems with even to this day, there's some problems with reading the Sumerian. On the one hand, it is very well known. A lot of texts have been read. We probably know more about Sumerians than we care to. But on the other hand, Sumerian not being related to any other language, and then on the other hand, it being completely permeated by the Akkadian words and inclusions, it's really hard to decipher what is Sumerian, what is kind of a borrowed linguistic sets. The language itself, in the writing system, there was a high variability of the sign usage. So the same sign could be used by different scribes to represent different things, or different signs sometimes were used to represent the same thing. And because the language itself and the writing system lasted, basically this language finally stopped being used in 600 AD. This written form, there were still known scribe schools for the Sumerian, well, not Sumerian, but by that point in time, much adapted, but the cuneiform writing system in 600 AD. So this is a writing system that lived for something like between 4,000 and 6,000 years. Very widely used. So to this date, even people who are professional scientists who study particularly Sumerian cuneiform, they don't have any sort of a unified dictionary. So each specialist winds up having to compile their own dictionary for their own personal use. Because in Sumerian language, you have, your signs, and then what they did later on, they started putting modifiers next to the signs to indicate what it meant. For example, like if you have a modifier, it might mean the name of a ruler or just the general name of a person. And if you don't have a modifier, it might mean, I don't know, house. Final thing is nobody knows what it sounded like. Scientists just have no idea what the phonetics of the Sumerian language was. So we know how to read it because we have the Akkadian, because Akkadians were also using the exact same writing system. So we know how they were using it, but how the actual Sumerian word sounded, nobody knows. So our biggest issue with the Sumerians is Sumerologists do not know what the Sumerians actually refer to themselves as. Because the word that I used earlier, the Kengir word, it's more of a nickname. Usually when people's name themselves, they name themselves something like the people, or the only people, or the humans. That's almost every human tribe self-title is something along those lines. We are the people, everyone else is not the people. Well, what we have for the Sumerians is the word Kengi, which basically means dark-haired or black-headed, which is not usually a self-name of a tribe. That's obviously a nickname of a tribe. Nobody knows where they came from. It's clear that they migrated into the region from somewhere, that they were fairly sophisticated by the time they arrived to the region. But where they came from, nobody knows. It's hard to define them anthropologically, and we will go into more depth into each one of these, issues. In other words, who of these people, of these remains, of these pictograms or pictures that we have, which one of these are actually Sumerians, and which one of these are other people who kind of call themselves Sumerians, but really are not ethnically Sumerian? We know the order of their kings. By the way, Gilgamesh is listed in the official list of the kings of the Sumerians as an actual living individual early on in one of the early dynasties. So we know the order of the kings and the rulers, but we have no idea what dates to attach to that order of the kings and when they may have ruled. We have no idea how their names sounded because we don't know the phonetics of the language. And we're not entirely sure all the reasons for why the civilization, which was far more sophisticated, was walled cities and, pretty impressive for that time period military resources, and was their access to metal usage, which the invading Akkadian people did not have. We're not entirely sure why the Sumerians caved in. Most likely it's because of the internal strife. So in Sumerian, the word Kengir means black-headed, right? And that's what they call themselves. Well, that might be a good place to start to try to figure out who the Sumerians are and where they came from, right? Because if they're dark-haired or black-headed, well, there must have been somebody light-headed. Logical? Logical. Couple problems. The Akkadians also refer to themselves by the exact same moniker. But it's not a Semitic word, so it must have not been an Akkadian word. So, okay, it must be a Sumerian word. It's something that they brought with themselves. So they're living in an area where pretty much all the humans around them are either Semitic or themselves. So if they're dark-headed, who the heck is light-headed? Well, there was a bunch of, theories that they might have had some blonde or red-haired people living near them. But no such correlation was found anywhere in the language, and nowhere in the surrounding area or any supposed areas of their origin. But what other peoples on this planet use such defining qualities to refer to entire peoples as black-headed? Well, the closest peoples who do that turned out to be the Tunguts, and that's, basically Proto-Chinese, one of the Proto-Chinese populations. I mean, it's in the rough territory of China, which is pretty far-fetched, right? It's pretty far away. But they do have such a concept as black-headed, and black-headed is used to refer to human beings in that language. It's Tungut language. Well, what is it versus? Well, it's versus the red-faced people. And when the linguists started digging into what the red-faced people were, well, it turned out that they were monkeys, actual monkeys with tails. Because this goes so far back in human history that this is a situation where you have small human tribes living surrounded by the forests that are filled literally with primates, and who to them are not that much different from themselves. And so if we are the people, they are the monkeys, and that was the kind of division. It's not us light-skinned people versus them dark-skinned people. It's not us people who practice this religion versus people who practice that religion. It's us humans versus them red-faced animals of the forest. I don't know, to me that's a pretty profound kind of thought, because that just smells of such archaic realities, to where it's all the people against all the wild animals. I don't know, when I actually read this little study, to me, I mean, it's like, cold chills. But so who are the Tunguts? Well, they are part of the basically the Sino-Tibetan civilization, and which is basically what gave rise to a lot of modern Chinese ethnicities. And the interesting thing that supports this particular hypothesis is the fact that later on, remember I mentioned how the Akkadian culture was ran over, the Sumero-Akkadian Empire was ran over by the Kuti, barbarian tribes that came rolling in from the mountains that were fairly unsophisticated comparing to the much more civilized by that point in time Akkadians and Sumerians. Well, the Kuti in much later Akkadian texts are also named red-faced, which would make sense, because if you have barbaric tribes rolling over your civilized cities and you want to use an insulting term for them, why not call them monkeys, right? So that's a theory that seems fairly sound, but there are other theories also as to their origin. But this would place them somewhere near the origin of all the modern, Sino-Tibetan, Chino-Tibetan, basically, and related languages. Wherever those people came from, it seems like the Sumerians were not a part of them, but they had something to do with them, maybe were their neighbors or something like that. Any questions, comments, anyone?
The prevailing Western science about the origins of the Sumerians is from West Asia, some genetic links to the Indus Valley have been, but that may still fit in with the theory Julie just gave. Also, there's some speculation they might have come out of North Africa. But the point is, we really don't know. You just try to sort through it and do the best you can with it, I guess. But I just wanted to mention that.
And yeah, well, and that's what I'm trying to get at. We don't know who Sumerians are. That's why I'm just covering some of the more sound theories. And of course, in this podcast, I'm covering mostly Soviet and Russian theories, which are solid and which usually get very little coverage in the West. Now, the thing with the Russian, just real quick aside, the Russian linguistic school of comparative linguistics and reconstructive linguistics, versus the American School of Reconstructive and Comparative Historical Linguistics disagree greatly on a lot of subjects. Because the American School of Reconstructive Linguistics takes the approach of plugging in a bunch of words into a computer and letting it run comparisons, which is fairly fast and accurate, but is very limited in what you can work with, because the number of individual names, toponyms, and various other words that can be clearly assigned to a specific language group is fairly limited. A lot of other words could be there could be accidental correlations. They can be, convergent sounds. They can be a lot of things. The Russian school of I can't say today, comparativistics, of comparative linguistics, is based on a different principle. What you have is you have people who learn multiple languages, up to 250 languages in their lifetime. And they physically sit down with lists of words from each language. They eliminate the words that they believe are borrowed from nearby neighboring languages, and they start meticulously, word by word, comparing the basic lexicon from each language, looking for correlations. And there is actually a scientific mathematical formula, the way that words migrate from one language to another. For example, Barbara in English language is Varvara in Russian language. Byzantine Empire in Russia is Byzantine Empire. Saint Basil is Saint Vasil. So every time you have a B sound, for example, in Germanic languages in Russian, it always migrates to a V sound. And these kind of correlations, they're very mathematic. Like when a language migrates to another form, it changes. The same sounds always migrate the same way. There's a rule to it. So what you have is a person who spends their entire life doing these comparisons, and what they try to do is they try to bring down two neighboring related languages to the point where they can reconstruct the lexicon of the language that was the predecessor, the parent language to the two existing languages. And once they have that parent language, and of course this is a process that takes literally a lifetime, then they take those newly reconstructed languages and then they start reconstructing them, the convergent languages. The idea is to eventually get to the very first language, if such a thing ever existed. But it is a very time-consuming, very meticulous process that requires a lot of linguistic knowledge. Not as popular in the West. So there's some disagreements between the two schools, though on major things they do kind of agree. That's what we know about the linguistics, and that's the linguistic theory that I'm most convinced by. We will go over a couple of the other ones. Now, what do we know about who they were, what they physiologically look like? Well, based on the pictures that they were originally, back when they were discovered, this whole civilization was discovered, just based on their, self-depiction, they were originally defined as kind of being a European, Mediterranean type peoples. But then they started finding statues, and the problem was the statues all look different. Now I'm doing screen sharing, and maybe it will even work. No, that's not my statues. Go back. Yeah. Right there. Yeah. So these are votive statues. Basically, there were statues that people would give. You can see, everybody can see the screen, right? So these are the statues that people would, offer to the gods for when they were asking for something. And you can see that these people all look very different. I mean, body type, face type, heights, anthropological type. It's really hard to tell what these people may have been. So, okay, so the statues don't help us enough a lot. Then it turned out, as they started researching more, that Sumerian art was actually highly stylized, and those statues actually look nothing like the people who were giving them. So the statues, and so was the painted art. So we have no idea what they look like, because just like Egyptian art, which depicts the pharaoh the size of the, spaceship, and his subjects the size of an ant, that's not representative of actually how those people looked or how tall they were. So next thing we get, and we know that it was stylized because the big eyes, it turns out that the big eyes, they represent wisdom and being open to knowledge and being receptive to the God's messages. So that's just, it doesn't mean that they actually had big eyes as individuals. What it means is that they wanted to present themselves that way to look good for the gods, basically. And the rest of it, the wool skirt, the sandals, the beard, that's all stylized stuff. And then, moreover, they started finding that similar kind of art forms existed in cultures that way predate the Sumerians. So it seems to be that this whole way of depicting people traveled as a meme throughout the region way before Sumerians arrived, and kind of doesn't have much to do with the Sumerians whatsoever. Then they started looking at the cemeteries and trying to analyze the remains, what David was saying. Well, the problem is we don't know who's buried at those cemeteries. We just know that people from the region are buried at that cemetery, but were they actually Sumerians? Or were they visiting population? Nobody knows. So the anthropological, physiological remains don't give us a lot of help either, that for all we know, these could have been migrant peoples. So from everything that they can tell, there's no such thing as Sumerians. I mean, there must have been an original ethnic group that were the Sumerians to begin with, but by the time they became a civilization, what we have is kind of a situation similar to New York City, where you have people from different cultures, different ethnic groups, who all have adapted the same umbrella culture, and they all call themselves Sumerians. Moreover, later on, it turns out in Akkadian text that anybody who moved to the area known as Sumeria started calling themselves Sumerian. So kind of like saying, I'm a Bostonian, or I'm, I don't know, Texan. It's kind of, it doesn't mean that you belong to an ethnic group. It just means that you belong to this community, this area, this neighborhood. So basically, race anthropology, what do we know about the Sumerians? Well, we know nothing about the Sumerians. I'm going to cover just a couple more things, and we're going to stop there because we're getting close to running out of time. So as far as their origins go, what do we know about where they migrated from? Well, we know that they migrated because they say that they migrated. And they say that they migrated from a wonderful land of Arata, that nobody knows where Arata was. What we know about the land of Arata? Well, we know that in the Sumerian language, Arata came to mean eventually excellent. Whatever this place was, the Sumerians themselves thought of it as a highly sophisticated place. There was even a saying in Sumerian language to say that something was made, like if I don't know, I made a vase and I brought it to you guys and you said, oh, that looks like it was made in Arata. That just means that's really excellent work. It's perfect. The problem is that Sumerians themselves were not particularly interested in their texts was the issue of where they migrated from. They just knew that they migrated from somewhere, and they were more interested was their social organization at the time and future, and less interested was their past. So they didn't spend a lot of time of talking about any of it. Their belief system, they claimed that the people in general, all human beings, originated in Barhain. And there was some actually Proto-Sumerian archaeological finds in that region. So there's a theory that they might have migrated through the Barhain region, or possibly they came from Hindustan. So that's just a couple of the theories. So in 1960, there came out an article by the scientist Gilba who kind of brought a new light to the question of, who were Sumerians. He said, look, we need to separate these three topics. Race is a separate issue, ethnicity. Ethnicity is a whole separate, basically belonging to what culture you believe yourself to be, is a separate issue. And linguistic is a separate issue, because the peoples can take on a foreign language as their main language, right? So he suggested that we look at those issues separately. Well, that didn't help either. Because the language from 3000 BC to about 1000 BC was used by all local tribes and nationalities. It was used by the Akkadians, Subarians, by the Alanites, and every other little tribe and every little group that migrated into the territory. For a while, it was the most prestigious language. It became the high society language, like Greek was in Rome, like Greek was later on in certain European cultures, like Latin was in medieval Europe. And just another little interesting note about the Sumerian language. There we know two dialects of Sumerian language. There is the proper Sumerian, which is what everybody talked when it was still a spoken language, which is normal, grammatically correct Sumerian. But there was also the High Sumerian. And at first, the scientists thought that the High Sumerian was specific female dialect, because in some cultures you have a special dialect that only the women use and men don't. Well, later it got proven that that was not the case. What the High Sumerian was actually kind of refined, exquisite, very high class Sumerian. It was a language that, yes, women used because they were considered to be more refined, and also the priests and the scholars of the culture used. So if you spoke High Sumerian, that just meant that you were really kind of intellectual elite of the society. So a couple other theories of their origin. There is the Australoid Polynesian theory, and that's the banana languages theory. We were trying to look it up right before the podcast. I used to know a lot about it. I forgot a lot about it. But the banana language theory basically comes with the idea that a lot of the early languages consisted of repeating sounds like ba, na, e, na, e, la, repeating words like that. And that was how humans originally started complicating words in their languages, by just repeating different syllables. And these languages, they are mostly spread out in basically Melanesian area, and which would put the origin of the Sumerians somewhere kind of really far away from where we find them when they at their heights. And that's kind of the idea that they were part of the Australoid migration, and the same migration that we talked about last time that wound up spreading through, founding the Harappan civilization and early migration into Polynesian regions and, that settled Australia, settled Tasmania and all those places, that they belong to that group of people. That's a possibility. There are some similarities in the language. For example, the words for a lot of naturally occurring plants, such as opiate plants, for example, are almost identical in the two groups of languages. There's some ceramic finds that are similar, but it's really just a free-floating theory. The other theory that I find to be a little bit more out there too is the Yeniseian hypothesis. And the Yeniseian group of languages is the group of languages that is kind of spread out from what's modern day Russia, northern regions, and also encompasses some of the Mesoamerican languages, because it's that wave of migration that went from Siberia to Americas. And again, it kind of implies the same idea that the Sumerians separated from that group of languages before they broke up into those groups. The problem with that is that really the majority of them, we don't know who the first migration of the peoples into the Americas were, but there's a good chance they had at least some Mongoloid admixture, and Sumerians decidedly, at least according to what information we have, are not Mongoloid, and their languages are not terribly related, it seems like. The Sino-Tibetan hypothesis is the one that seems to make the best sense, and that's basically suggesting that Sumerian language was not related to the people who populated the Tibetan plateau and that populated later some regions of China, but that they were neighboring with those cultures, because there's certain word lexicon terms in the Sumerian language that are very closely related to some of the terminology in what later became the basis for some of the Chinese and Tibetan dialects. Sorry, I need a drink here before I'm like, does anybody have any questions before I keep going on? So bottom line is, there seems to be some indication that they may have lived wherever the origin of the people who later became the population of, Central Asia, but that the actual language belonged to a group of languages that never developed any writing systems, and that simply went altogether extinct. Another, just an interesting thing that kind of one of the terms that I found interesting that seems to be similar in those languages. So Dingi is a term for kind of a high deity, for heavens, for something that's high and above in Sumerian, right? Well, that's Tengi or Tengri in Mongolian, Proto-Mongolian, and that's your Tian in Chinese. And those are all the same variants of the same word, and it's very good chance that that was a borrowed concept in the Sumerian language from their neighboring correlation to some of those tribes. So they may have come from wherever the origin of those cultures was, which we don't really know where that was either. So yeah, we don't know who the Sumerians were or where they came from. I think we're about out of time, and I still got quite a bit of stuff to cover, so we might have to do a little bit more of, well, I don't know, are you guys okay with going maybe about 15 minutes over? Everybody okay with it?
Sure.
Then we'll just be done with the Sumerians and we can move on to, because after this I want to finally get to our nomads. I'm super excited to cover the nomadic people, because I don't think that just gets enough coverage whatsoever. So what kind of culture did the Sumerians have? Well, they had a very specific and distinct kind of culture. Their culture was very similar to what we have in the city-states of Greece. And it's called the agonal type of culture. That's the word agonistic, to antagonize. It means that it was a competitive culture. It was a culture where everybody and everything competed with each other. And we see that very clearly later in the Greek city-states between, Athens and Sparta and so on, so forth. This kind of culture happens periodically in human history. Again, the Sumerians were that way, the Greeks were that way, some of the Arab cultures were that way, where you have intercultural, very active, not so much conflict as competition. One thing that it does, it prevents unification of the peoples into any sort of cohesive unit, and sometimes serves not very well to that particular ethnic group. Again, the Greeks, they wound up falling to the Romans. The Arabs had something else to unify them. They had Islam to unify them, but the Sumerians really didn't have anything to unify them at all. They continued to compete. They continued to have intercity-state warfare, and they never were able to unite against any sort of outside invasion. But how did this competition show up? Well, the same way that it did in Greek culture. They had something very similar to the Olympic Games. Actually, Gilgamesh was considered to be almost a patron of sports competitions. They had those between the cities. They had public debates between various political leaders. They had competitions between, even their gods were shown to compete with each other for power. They had fairy tales and little parables where they would compare two things. For example, they would compare, let's say, grown grain versus domesticated animals. And the whole parable would give examples as to why one is better or the other one. But they always would have to have a winner, and they would always have to have a loser. So the winner would be, they would say that, but if something, like, for example, if you have competition between a horse, well, they didn't have horses yet, between the domesticated animal. Actually they had donkeys. Their entire military was donkey driven, which I would love to see, a bunch of warfare with donkeys as your primary pulling animal. Yeah, that had to be interesting. I mean, donkeys are very loud and not very cooperative, last I checked. But yeah, so they would do a thing between, let's say, what was more useful to humans, let's say cattle or grain. And they would give arguments, well, grain is easier to grow, but cattle is more nutritious, but grain requires this, but cattle requires that. And eventually the whole argument would lead to one or the other one being chosen to exit the competition, which means that it won the competition. And there would always have to be a loser, somebody who's left behind. And this kind of a culture tends to appear when the settlements of the same type of culture, they are at fairly great physical distance from each other, to where that kind of cohesion is not achievable, and so intercultural competition occurs. Their social organization, well, their cities prior to the advent of kings, which happened much later in their history, they were led by two groups, something similar to a senate of the fathers of the city, but they also had another group that was the youth of the city. And of course, these two bodies of power always competed with each other. It was kind of a balance of power situation. They, all the city-states, they had a general meeting spot where they would get together periodically and define, discuss any sort of mutual concerns and issues, just like the Greeks did, for example, with Delphi. So basically it was kind of a form of democratic rule in a way before Greece. But what that sort of situation oftentimes leads to is when you have a kind of a Platonism, kind of idealized form of thinking, where the society tends to strive for perfection, strive for an ideal, strive for some sort of order that is almost unattainable in daily human life. And so what tends to happen is you divide the world into sections. You have the perfect section and the imperfect section. And for the Sumerians, the perfect idealized section was really the divine, to where the human reality always was striving to achieve that sort of divinity, that sort of perfection, that sort of organization. And so they came up with such thing as a category of Ma. And Ma is a force in the Sumerian culture that is basically, it is the energy of perfection. Ma is magical energy that people require to live, and that all divine creatures, whether they're gods and they're smaller kind of deities and monsters, without Ma, you're useless as a god. You cannot create, you cannot perform miracles, you can make no changes to the world around you. But Ma is something that is above gods as a class. It's greater and more important than any individual deity, than any individual society. And for them, their writing symbols, again, it was organized into the system of the sky versus, but basically the heavenly versus the earthly, to where, because Sumerians were very much interested in astrology and astronomy, as a lot of ancient people, they were watching the skies very closely for any changes, for any signs from the gods. And they saw the stars and everything that happened above as sort of divine writing system. It's divine symbols, right? Well, their writing system was intended to mirror that, to where you have divine messages from the gods up above, and you have the human messages for the people down below in the same way. And I'm pretty much almost done, but I need to cover the Anunnaki. When I got asked about Anunnaki, I tore my hair and I called Marvine and I said, Marvine, help me with Anunnaki, please, because I'm going to bang my head against the wall. Because I knew quite a bit about the religious system that they had. By the way, the afterlife in Sumerian reality was really a bleak place. Again, it was very similar to Greece. Everything that good happened to you here while you were here, when you died, you became kind of a miserable shade in the afterlife, and nothing good ever happened to you again. And actually, gods were very similar to Sumerians. Their gods, except for Inanna, who really liked to bang everything that walks, regardless of how many husbands she had at the time. Because she's not Ishtar yet, because Ishtar, she's kind of nice. She likes people because she likes to bang various people. Inanna is more, she's more of a, you kind of use them and throw them away kind. But she's the nicest one of all of the Sumerian gods. The rest of the Sumerian gods really don't care about people. Appealing to them is kind of pointless unless you start cutting down on their sacrificial gifts. The gods really don't care about what goes down on earth. I mean, to them, humans are really just a source of offerings. And that's very similar again to the Greek, idea to where gods are up there, we people are down here. And if we, regularly make offerings to the gods, maybe they won't send any plagues or disasters upon us, right? So who are the Anunnaki? Well, Anunnaki are basically, they're a divine race of people that is neither gods nor humans. They're elves. Basically, they're exact parallel to the elves or to the original fairies. They're that race of people that is not divine, not human, but right in between. They're not quite physical. They're not quite metaphysical. They're the first people, the magical race, right? So, for example, like in Norse religion, you have your Asas and Vans, but then you have your Alts, right? Or in Greek religion, you have your Zeus, all those Olympian gods. But then you have your Dryads, your Satyrs, your Nymphs, kind of lesser god folk. That's what Anunnaki really are. And they're a whole race of people. We don't even know their individual names. They just generally referred to as the people of Anunnaki. And their job was really to serve some of the higher gods, which, by the way, were known as Igigi on Veleni. Those are the actual gods. Anunnaki was just kind of basically their errand boys. Where did the idea of Anunnaki being some ancient alien DNA altering, I don't know, whatever it was. Well, that idea came from a specific author by his name is Zacharias Sitchin. He is a semi-researcher of the script. He's a I would say fiction writer. I mean, if you subscribe to the ancient alien theory, you don't have to believe me. And you can think that, it's a conspiracy to cover it up. Anunnaki, for example, were used by the people of, Sumeria and Babylon later to just explain how, for example, great walls of old cities were built. This whole idea or those walls were built by the Cyclops, right? Because we lost that technology and we now don't remember how it's done. But in reality, this was just a race of lesser gods, kind of the first creation of the divine. And another reason where this concept originated from is because at the time when this whole concept was pushed forward, it was around the 1930s, 40s, somewhere around then. That was before the Harappan civilization was very well studied. It was before some of the older civilizations were discovered, the ones we talked about last time. I'm not going to be able to say this word again. Gebel Tepe. I can never say it. I will never be able to say it. I think it's my curse. You know what I'm talking about. The monument was the stelas and the woman and the cats that we talked about last time. And, but it's before the more ancient civilizations were discovered. So at that time, the Sumerian civilization seemed like it was a beacon of light among the barbaric surrounding reality. It was like the only civilization among the barbarians. And so it seemed very mysterious and unusual. And where did it come from? But now that we have studied and seen a lot more of the surrounding area, we can easily tell that this was a progressive process. It was not an instant process. That agriculture, animal husbandry, metal, by the way, what the Sumerians did do is they propagated these ideas, right? Irrigation is something that they heavily developed. They, to the point where they had this neat thing that if you have a lot of water, well, you have special gate on irrigation you could open up and the water flows out. And if you don't have a lot of water, well, then you close the little door, right? And the water accumulates. And that irrigation system pretty much lasted until the Arab conquest of the area. Yeah. The metal is another thing that they came up with. Swords seem to appear, at least in that part of it. Well, metal appeared independently very many times in very many parts of human history and cultures. But for that particular region at that time, really the Sumerian civilization seemed to be the propagator of, the first. Yeah. And they also came up with the concept of the sword. And this, again, in this area, that's again something that humans invent over and over. But the sword is a pretty cool kind of different and special thing, right? Because with any other weapon, you can chop up wood, you can kill animals, you can chop up people's heads. With a sword, it only has one purpose, and that's to kill people. And that means professional military class, which is something that Sumerians kind of started developing. So the art of killing people for a living kind of came from them. The will is something they probably did not invent it, but they definitely propagated it. And the will is a really cool thing, because if you put it this way, you can roll in it, right? And it's a lot better than putting, your carts in really big tree trunks, or it's even better than having your barely tamed cows dragged behind them sleds, right across the desert. That's not going to be a very happy cow, and that's not going to be a very efficient way of moving around. Well, Sumerians put their wheels and made them lighter, but they also came up with the idea of turning the wheel, and then now you can make clay pottery, right, on the spinning wheel, which there are some researchers that believe that those two concepts are one resulting from the other in one direction or the other. And what else am I missing? Well, writing, of course, political system, priesthood, as a organized warfare in that region. Definitely organized warfare is tactics and stuff like that. And basically sports competitions, public debate, literature, not just religious texts, but actual, basically what we would call today philosophical literature. And speaking of philosophical literature, I kind of want to finish this, because I started it with Gilgamesh, and I want to finish it with another story from the Sumerian texts. And that is called From the Conversations with a Slave. And it goes something like that. Master: talk to me, slave. Yes, master, says the slave. Yes, master, I will talk to you. I'm here to talk to you. Listen, slave, I want to get married. Get married, master. Get married, master. A wife is a beautiful thing. She will bring comfort to your home. She will tend to you. She will oversee all your belongings. She will give you joy. She will bring you children. I don't think I want to get married, slave. Don't get married, master. Don't get married, master. A wife she's just a hustle. She is a lot of scandals. She will steal all your money. She will eat all your resources. She will make your life impossible. Don't get married, master. Slave: I think I want to go to war. Go to war, master. War is glory. War is honor. War is a lot of loot. You're going to become famous. You're going to become great. Slave: I don't think I want to go to war. Don't go to war, master. War is dirt. War is blood. War is danger. There's not a good idea to go to war. And so on and so forth for many, many, many pages, to where the master proposes all these different, completely opposing ideas to the slave, and the slave agrees with each and every one of them, finding an argument to either do it or not do it. At one point in time, he wants to become a bandit. And the slave says, oh, yes, master, become a bandit. You're going to be able to rob those rich merchants. And he says, I don't want to be a bandit. Well, don't be a bandit, because, the rulers will come upon you and execute you. And then he wants to go to court, and he wants to buy land and become a farmer, and the slave is supporting him in everything. And in the end of this very long speech, the master finally says, slave, but what is the right thing to do for me? What choice should I make? And the slave says, break my neck, master. Break your own neck and throw our bodies in the ditch. That's pretty much the Sumerian view of reality. That's a very cheerful, upbeat people who like their beer and enjoyed living their life while they could and didn't really expect anything good from anything else. I'm not sure what to make of that particular work of literature, because it's rather lengthy, but it's an interesting text. Yes, Jake?
Sounds like a perfect example of a yes man.
Yes, somebody in one discussion was suggested that maybe he just had a bad relationship with his slave. Okay, the next time we're going to go to Proto-Aryans, okay, and I know the term Aryan in American culture has a very negative connotation. That is not the word's fault. Just because somebody else took that term and used it to very negative connotation to mean something that, by the way, the word Aryan never meant. Aryans were not blue-eyed, they were not blonde-haired, they were definitely not Nazis. They were just the people living in a nomadic, well, first not a nomadic, they were living in a very cold region of a very cold part of, Europe, in very small dugout houses waiting for the great snowfall to end with their little cute, itty-bitty cute furry cows before they began their long and arduous trek from Siberia all the way across modern territory of Russia, Ukraine, and into what eventually became their homeland. And along the way, they met the love and the the love of their life, whole existence, and they're really their soulmates, and that's wild horses, whom they have managed to successfully domesticate, unlike a lot of other people who tried before and after them. And with their horses, eventually, several thousand years later, these people are going to conquer majority of the world. And most of us here, with some very few exceptions, of one way or another, either their descendants, or we speak a language that is in one way or another descended from the Indo-Aryan, Indo-European languages. I mean, the horse is what made it possible for them to burst out and really just triumphantly march all around the known world at that time. And it's a subject that is very rarely covered, and I haven't seen very many lectures, discussions, really articles in the Western. There's the couple, there's a conference, I mean, but it seems to be mostly limited to very narrow specialists in the field and not generally publicly known. And these are amazing and awesome people, so that's what I want to talk about next time. We're getting into our nomads, finally. Everybody good with that? Next Thursday, same time?
Sounds good to me. I think that's worked out pretty well.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for jumping in.
See you then. Thanks.
Bye. See you next week. Bye.
Orange glow of a campfire, pale electrical glow. Both cast out shadows as our legends unfold. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul. And we will live forever as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul. And we will live forever, or as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul.